right, everyone. This is our last big chapter. So we're going to talk about the digestive system in this chapter. So for your last exam, this will make up a majority of the questions. There will be some from 23 and 24. As usual, I'm going to be posting a study guide slash study outline to go along with the chapter. But this has a little more bulk than 23 and 24. So I would focus your studying a little bit more on the digestive system just because there's a lot of pieces to it. Okay, there's my cursor. Perfect. Okay, functions of our digestive system. So of course, that the biggest function is to break down our food into components that we can actually utilize to transform into ATP. It's not as if we eat a piece of chicken in our cells, suck in that chicken, and can make it directly into energy. We have to break it down into all of its component parts before we can really use it. So there's kind of two parts to this process. The actual breaking down of food that occurs with enzymes, as well as mechanical digestion. So we'll talk about it as chemical and mechanical breakdown. We'll get into that a little bit further in the chapter. And then we obviously need to absorb those nutrients and chemicals, and we'll talk about how we do that as well. So this is a bit of an overview of the digestive system. So it starts in our mouth, travels through our pharynx, down the esophagus, into the stomach. It then goes to our small intestine. It goes down into our, all the way through the small intestine. That's where a lot of our absorption itself occurs. And then it gets to our large intestine, which is primarily our waste products at that point. And it moves all the way to where our feces go to our anus. So there's a few different parts to things. Propulsion is swallowing, and peristalsis, that term is more or less rhythmic contractions of smooth muscle to help our food move. And so that occurs in a few different places throughout our digestive system. The chemical digestion starts with the stomach and continues throughout the small intestine. And then we also have mechanical digestion that happens in the mouth, the stomach, and the small intestine as well. But like I said, don't worry too much about this diagram other than that it's an overview, because we are going to talk about this stuff in depth. Okay, so we're going to jump to the digestive tract itself, actually. So we're going to talk about the tissue layers there. So the mucosa, we're going to start in and work our way out. So the mucosa is our innermost layer. It has three layers itself. So the inner layer of epithelium, it has a thin layer of smooth muscle that helps with the peristalsis. And so don't worry about the mini layers too much. You just need to know that the mucosa is the innermost layer. So of course, it's called the mucosa because it secretes mucus, but it also secretes digestive enzymes and hormones, which are very important for digestion. So it helps us absorb our nutrients after digestion occurs. And this is what actually contains our lymphoid tissue, our Peyer's patches. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So the submucosa is a thicker layer of connective tissue. So it's what has our glands, our blood vessels, the lymph vessels, and our nerves are in there too. We'll talk about that here shortly, but our digestive tract actually has a very vast nerve network. The muscularis layer, we're here in this thicker layer here because it's muscle. So it has two layers. The smooth muscle or inner layer encircles the whole tract, and the outer layer kind of runs just parallel or longitudinally with the tract. And so this is really our major motor for peristalsis, or to keep stuff moving. The serosa is our outermost layer. It's quite a thin layer. It's more of a covering. And then, as we said, our digestive system has its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system. It's extremely complex. The nervous system has what's known as the myenteric nerve plexus. So if you remember back from the nervous system chapter, we talked about a plexus being a large network of nerves. So you have your cervical plexus, your brachial plexus, your lumbar and sacral plexus. So that's going to result that's going to lay between that smooth muscle inner layer and our longitudinal muscle layer. And then we have our submucosal nerve plexus, which is in the submucosal layer. So as you said, that contains some nerves, but the myenteric nerve plexus, another large part, is in between our two muscle layers. And we'll talk a little bit more about the nervous system here shortly. So it consists of 500 million neurons and more than 30 neurotransmitters, which are very similar to the brain, which is why sometimes they consider the enteric nervous system the second brain. It communicates a lot with the brain, and it can affect mood and behavior. That's why people can say you're getting hangry. That's a good example of that. And let's say for whatever reason, we're not getting, whether it's a spinal cord injury, something going on that's preventing the central nervous system communicating with the enteric nervous system, it can kind of function independently. It doesn't necessarily need the brain to tell it what to do. It kind of has its own set of rules, own code, and it will continue to do its work even when we have a disruption in our central nervous system and enteric nervous system communication. Okay, the peritoneum. So the peritoneum is layers of, the layers of our visceral peritoneum is the mesentery. So the best way I can describe mesenteries is large groups of tissue. So it helps suspend our digestive organs. It's almost like how they put packing peanuts or bubble wrap around things that they send in packages. So our mesentery kind of fills in all the spaces between our organs and helps keep them in place. So it also contains our blood vessels, our nerves, our lymph vessels, and our lymph nodes. We just talked about the lymphatic system not too long ago. We also have our mesocolon, and that is part of the peritoneum. It's not necessarily part of the colon, but it fixes or attaches our colon to that posterior abdominal wall. So when we're discussing the mesenteries, like you see here, mesentery of the small intestine, they kind of discuss it in sections based on which organ it is protecting and fixating and supplying vessels and nerves to. So the entire peritoneum is considered from this greater curvature of the stomach, and it will hang down all the way down over the small intestine. And so there's kind of a large, what they call an apron of mesentery. That's known as your greater omentum. That's just a very, very large portion of the mesentery. It's also very important because it's so large, it has a very large number of blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, all that stuff we just discussed. There's a lot of fat that's scattered throughout our omentum. The book says it gives it a lacy appearance, but it also helps because it, like I said, it provides cushioning. It helps prevent friction, and it also helps localize infection. As we said, there's kind of sections of mesentery in the omentum. So say we have an area of inflammation in the stomach. The omentum is going to kind of adhere or block that area off so that infection can't spread throughout the entire abdomen. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more. So I said the greater omentum is a large portion of that mesentery. It lays over top of the small intestine. It kind of, like I said, it's considered more like an apron because it lays all the way across that small intestine area. And you see the large intestine is kind of the borders of that as well. The lesser omentum is going to be from that greater curve of the stomach, this upper curve of the stomach, and that's going to extend between the stomach and the liver, more or less. Okay, so this goes back to our layers of the digestive tract. So which layer contracts and relaxes to propel food forward? Is it the mucosa layer, the muscularis layer, the submucosal layer, or the serosa layer? be the muscularis. The mucosa is the innermost layer, and if you remember, I did say that there's a small amount of smooth muscle in that layer that helps a bit, but it is definitely not the primary muscle layer that helps with movement. The muscularis has much more muscle bulk to do peristalsis. That submucosa layer, that's got a lot of connective tissue, our glands, blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. The serosa is that outermost covering that kind of just is our protective layer or covering layer of the digestive tract within the cavity. Okay, so we break down the organs of the digestive system into accessory organs and digestive organs. So the little asterisks there, they just mean we can't see them in this picture. Don't worry, it's not that those are the most important ones or anything. And then our digestive tract itself is also known as the alimentary canal. So the alimentary canal is what is kind of covered by this blue box here. Oops. For whatever reason, it's showing a little lower than I originally said it. But the alimentary canal or the digestive tract actually includes the full kind of mouth to pharynx, esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, the rectum, and the anus. So all of those together are our alimentary canal. The accessory organs, which really help with digestion, are the teeth, the tongue, our salivary glands, our liver, our pancreas, and our gallbladder. So make sure you understand which parts are considered truly the digestive tract or alimentary canal versus the accessory organs, which help us with getting our food and digesting our food throughout that tract. Okay, so this is kind of the zoomed in view of our mouth. This is where our digestion actually starts. So our tongue is a super strong muscle, and it's covered by a mucous membrane. So it can reposition food during chewing, and of course it has taste buds, which are also known as lingual papillae. That's kind of the scientific term for taste buds. It allows for more surface area on our tongue as well, and obviously that's what allows us to taste food. This lingual frenulum, that's that fold of the membrane that kind of anchors the tongue to the floor of the mouth. There's a lot of superficial blood vessels on the floor of the mouth as well, which from a clinical standpoint is very important for sublingual or under the tongue medications like nitroglycerin that can help stop a heart attack is one good example of this. The hard palate, that is formed by the maxilla and palatine bones. You have to think way back to when we discussed the bony or the skeletal system chapter, some of our facial bones there. So the maxilla and palatine bones, that's what forms our hard palate. And that actually separates our mouth from the nasal cavity. Because one interesting thing about the head is that, in a sense, everything is somewhat connected in terms of our canals, whether it be the nose, the ears, the mouth. So that hard palate actually blocks off the mouth from the nasal cavity. We also have the soft palate that's got mostly muscle, and that kind of forms the arch between the mouth and the nasopharynx. That it also can help move our food initially down into our throat and esophagus. And then most people have heard of the uvula, our little punching bag in the back of the mouth. And there's not much to know about the uvula except for it kind of triggers our gag reflex a bit, but nothing crazy important there. And then it just also shows a couple of the salivary ducts. So of course our mouth has to salivate. It's very important for digestion. So we have salivary ducts that kind of are the main source of our saliva. Okay, we'll talk about the salivary glands a little bit more. As I just said, they're very important in the chemical digestion aspect of things. So we have three main glands: our parotid gland, which is up here, kind of behind the ear, right with the jaw, the submandibular gland down lower here, and then the sublingual gland under our tongue. Those are our three primary glands. They all have ducts that kind of transfer the saliva from the gland to the mouth itself. And the reason that saliva is quite important in the digestion process is that it contains enzymes. So if you remember, for those of you who have taken medical terminology, or if you haven't, this is a good suffix to know. ACE, ASE, is the suffix for any enzyme. So anytime you see the ending ACE, you know that you're dealing with an enzyme. So two of the most important ones for us, amylase, that is going to break down starch, and lipase is going to begin digesting fat. So our other accessory here, our teeth, are going to assist with the mechanical digestion part of things. You see we have a few different types of teeth. That's because some of our teeth are better at cutting and tearing. Some of our teeth back here that are flatter are better at grinding. So there's a function that follows form. So that's the reason that our teeth don't look exactly the same. So as soon as food enters the mouth and is chewed, which the scientific term for chewing is mastication, that's when digestion begins. So we have our saliva, obviously, that is introducing those enzymes, and our chewing that's breaking down the food mechanically. That allows the food to become moistened and bound with saliva, and we continue the digestion process from there. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the internal structure of our teeth. So I kind of highlighted all the important parts for you. So the bulk of our tooth is what is known as dentin. So that's this first, or not really first, but the first inner layer of our teeth is dentin. The top covering, or the white part of our teeth, is actually our enamel. So that's more of a protective covering for the dentin itself. The crown of our tooth is known as the portion of our tooth that's above the gum line. The pulp cavity is the next part we'll talk about. That is in here, this inner cavity within the dentin. So that, as you can see, contains our blood vessels. It has lymphatic vessels and nerves as well. We have the periodontal ligament. That is right in here, and it kind of wraps around a bit. So that lines the socket of our tooth. That whole kind of section in here, that is not enamel. That is the periodontal ligament. That lines our socket, and then the fibers from the ligament kind of grow and attach to anchor the tooth in place. So when you lose a tooth as a kid, we're kind of that reason it doesn't just come out so easily is because that periodontal ligament is securing that tooth into the socket. We also have connective tissue known as cementum. And so that's down this way, that runs just below, above, within the periodontal ligament. So that is what covers our dentin in the root. So we have enamel that covers our dentin in the crown, and cementum, which covers the dentin in the root. Those nerve and blood vessels actually have an opening down here at the root, which is known as the root canal. And so that's how they can enter and exit the tooth. So you do need to understand the parts of the tooth here. That's why I spent some time going through that. All right, so going back to our beginning of the digestion process, which enzyme acts in the mouth to begin the breakdown of starch? Is it amylase? Is it pepsin? Is it trypsin? Or is it sucrase? Amylase is the correct answer. So pepsin we'll talk about a little bit later because it acts in the stomach to digest protein. Trypsin is a pancreatic enzyme, and that also helps to break down protein. That is in the duodenum of the small intestine. We'll talk about that later. And one other one that is sucrase. Again, that's an enzyme, that ASE ending. And that is found in the intestine as well, which helps us digest sucrose, which is one of the types of sugar. Okay, the pharynx, that's kind of the initial portion of the throat, the back part of the mouth there. So food is initially broken down, moistened, and moved to the back of the throat. So our teeth, our tongue, the saliva, they break down, moisten the food, and then our soft palate helps us move it to the back of the throat. The soft palate then lifts, the larynx rises. That's the larynx is kind of our voice box, and our food then moves to the esophagus. So the esophagus is where our food travels rather than the trachea, which is part of our respiratory system. We do not want food into the trachea. That is not a good thing. Then it goes to the lungs, and that creates even more problems. Okay, so the esophagus, I've just combined those two, sorry guys. The esophagus connects the pharynx to the stomach. So we have a couple different sphincters, which are muscular rings that kind of open and close to help control the passage of food. So the first sphincter we get to is the lower esophageal sphincter, the LES. And so the primary job of this is to prevent backflow of stomach acid into the esophagus. So when you hear people saying they have acid reflux, that means that their LES is not doing its job quite well enough because some of that stomach acid is going back up into the esophagus, which can be extremely irritating. So there's glands within the wall of the esophagus. They're going to secrete mucus, and that helps lubricate the food so that as the peristalsis, or those wave-like muscle contractions, are propelling the food toward the stomach, there's not a lot of friction. Everything can flow smoothly. So from our esophagus, we get to this lower esophageal sphincter that we just talked about, and that is kind of the gateway to the stomach. So the tracts that we talked about earlier or the layers of the tract that we talked about earlier apply to the stomach as well. The muscularis layer of the stomach has an extra layer known as the oblique muscle. So our stomach does a lot of work, so it has extra muscle. So that layer is right in between our smooth muscle layer, the surrounding layer, and then our longitudinal layer. And so that really allows our stomach to contract and churn vigorously because that helps break up our food. It helps get all of the stomach acid and different enzymes that are in the stomach moving and kind of touching all the food. So it helps with digestion. You'll also see these bumps within the stomach known as rugae. So when it's empty, the mucosa and submucosa actually contract and fold into these rugae. So it shrinks when empty, and it allows it to expand when full, is really the reasoning we have those folds. Okay, this shows our stomach divided into the different parts. So it has 4 different regions. We have our cardia at this very top portion. We have the fundus, which is this upper curved portion. The bulk of the stomach is the body of the stomach. And then in this bottom portion, as we get closer to where the pyloric sphincter kind of opens to allow it to go to the small intestine, that's known as the pylorus. So I think everyone knows that our stomach's primary function is to store our food, but it also prepares our food for digestion. As we just talked about, it can contract and churn, which breaks our food up and allows it to mix with our gastric juices. That mixture of our food and our gastric juice is known as chyme. So once our stomach kind of breaks things down as it should and our small intestine is ready for it, the pyloric sphincter opens and allows the chyme to enter the duodenum, which is the first portion of our small intestine. So we're going to keep moving down the chain here. So like I said, our next stop is the small intestine. Oh, I forgot. We're going to go through kind of the step-by-step here again. So contractions, like we said, the stomach contracts and churns to break down our food, mix it with the gastric juices, then chyme is formed. Our pyloric sphincter is going to stay closed while the chyme is forming, and when it is ready and the small intestine has space, it is going to open up. the stomach is going to continue to mix its contents and gradually release chyme into the top portion of the small intestine. So you don't need to know this 30 milliliter number. Oops, sorry guys. You don't need to know this 30 milliliter number. The important thing to remember is that it's not just unloading all of its contents to the small intestine at once. And the reason for that is because our small intestine is super, super important in our absorption of nutrients and the remainder of the digestive process. So it wants a slow and steady flow so that it can get all of its job done without stuff just rushing through it. Okay, we'll talk about the gastric pits and enzymes a little bit. So our gastric mucosa have depressions known as gastric pits. And there's a few different glands known as our gastric glands, which provide the gastric pits with its various components of gastric juice. So just to be clear, this is still within the stomach. If you look at our little box here, this is the bottom lining of the stomach, and this is a zoomed in version. So you have mucus cells, and then there's what's known as enteroendocrine cells, which are going to secrete hormones. But these gastric pits are going to have gastric glands that line them so that they can get the contents that they need. So let's go through some of the different cells that make up these gastric pits. So we have our mucus cells that secretes mucus. It protects the stomach lining. We said that gastric juice is really acidic. So without the mucus, our stomach would get super upset. So our mucus cells secrete mucus to protect and stop irritation in the stomach lining. The parietal cells secrete the actual acidic portion of hydrochloric acid and another substance known as intrinsic factor. So intrinsic factor is very important for the absorption of B12, which is a vital vitamin in a lot of our body's processes. So the hydrochloric acid actually is not necessarily there to break down food. It's more to kill any bad things that are in swallowed food or microbes. Our chief cells are going to secrete digestive enzymes. One example of this is pepsinogen or pepsin that breaks down proteins. And then as I said earlier, there's finally enteroendocrine cells. So you know, our endocrine system is the hormone system. So this secretes the hormone ghrelin. So ghrelin is the hormone that increases our appetite. It kind of tells us when we're hungry. When you feel hungry, it means your ghrelin levels are elevated. So if you think of your stomach rumbling, one way to remember that ghrelin means hungry is your stomach goes ghrelin. And then there's kind of the opposite is leptin. You guys don't need to know that super in depth, but leptin is actually what is an appetite suppression. But remember, ghrelin is when you are going to stimulate appetite. It acts on the hypothalamus, and then gastrin is another enzyme secreted that is going to influence kind of how our digestive system is processing stuff. Okay, digestion is broken down into a few different phases. We have the cephalic phase. So think cephalic is the head. So we have sight, smell, taste, and even the thought of food. So even thinking about food will stimulate our stomach to secrete gastric juice and gastrin, kind of start the digestive process or prepare the digestive process. You think about food, your mouth is watering. That's the cephalic phase. Our digestive system kind of gets started just because we're thinking about the process of eating. We have our gastric phase. That's when food is actually entering the stomach. We're going to get even more increase in the secretion of our gastric juice and gastrin. And then we have the intestinal phase. So once the chyme actually enters our duodenum, our gastric secretions kind of stop, and now it's on our small intestine to do its job in digestion. Okay, so going back to the parts of the stomach, what is the purpose of rugae? Do they secrete gastric juice? Do they propel food? through the small intestine? Does it allow the stomach to expand, or does it help break our food into small particles? Answer is C, it allows our stomach to expand. I don't have a ton of insight for you on these other answers. In this case, that is really just the function of the rugae, and the others are not a function of the rugae, they're functions of other parts of our stomach. Okay, moving on to the liver next, actually. And the reason we're going to talk about the liver before we talk about the small intestine is because the liver secretes a substance known as bile, which is important for fat emulsification. And so our bile, which we'll talk about the gallbladder as well, which has a role in this, that bile helps our small intestine with breakdown to allow it to get the nutrients. So we're going to kind of work down that way before we get all the way to the small intestine, which is the next part of the digestive tract. Remember, the liver and the gallbladder are considered accessory organs of the digestive tract. So our liver is broken down into 4 lobes. You have 2 anterior, 2 posterior. The right and left halves are divided by this falciform ligament, and the falciform ligament also anchors our liver in place. So the liver is extremely important. We talked about the liver in the blood chapter. We talked about it in our circulatory system chapter in terms of the hepatic portal vein circulation. We talked about it in the endocrine system chapter related to storing and releasing glucose. It also processes vitamins and minerals. It helps filter toxins, and between the liver and the spleen, we help recycle old blood cells. So the caudate lobe, that is going to be right near the inferior vena cava. The quadrate lobe is next to the gallbladder. Those are our posterior lobes. You have the caudate lobe right near the inferior vena cava, and the quadrate lobe kind of makes a little square. That's near our gallbladder. So the gallbladder is a separate organ from the liver, but it's kind of more or less attached to the back portion of the liver. And then there's our hepatic artery and our hepatic portal vein that we talked about in a couple chapters ago. Okay, so this is a zoomed in kind of view of a hepatic lobule, or a functional unit of the liver. So they're 6-sided cylinders called hepatic lobules, and they fill the interior of our liver. There's a central vein here that passes through the core of each lobule. Then you have sheets of hepatic cells, so not just one hepatocyte. This is a whole sheet of hepatocytes or liver cells that fan out from the lobule. So in between these sheets, we have sinusoids. So if you remember from our blood vessel chapter, we talked about sinusoidal capillaries and how they have larger openings and they're very permeable. So this is what allows for a lot of exchange in terms of waste products and that side of things. And then there's also these green guys here are your canaliculi. And so they carry the bile that is secreted by hepatocytes, and they are carrying that to the gallbladder. So this just kind of breaks it down a little bit further step by step. So we have our hepatic portal vein, and that's going to be our branch that has a lot of nutrient-rich blood. The hepatic artery is what's going to have oxygen-rich blood. So the portal vein is deoxygenated blood, but has a ton of nutrients. The hepatic artery is going to have that oxygenated blood. Those both come and meet in the sinusoidal capillaries. That's the important capillaries that have a lot of permeability to them. And so they're going to actually filter the blood. We have our Kupffer cells. They're kind of like the defense system. They're going to remove our debris and bacteria. And then we have kind of everything ends up meeting in the central vein where blood can be fully processed and carried out. And then, like I said, you have these kind of green guys here. That's your canaliculi, and that's going to carry the bile from the hepatocytes into the hepatic ducts, which eventually lead to the gallbladder that stores our bile. Okay, so which liver structure filters blood to remove nutrients as well as toxins? Is it A, the Kupffer cells, B, the sinusoids, C, the canaliculi, or D, the hepatocytes? So B are sinusoids. Remember, the Kupffer cells are a defense system. They're phagocytic cells that help remove bacteria and debris. And then our canaliculi are going to be carrying that bile to the hepatic ducts and gallbladder that are secreted by the hepatocytes. All right, I know I've said this a few times now, but our gallbladder not only stores, but concentrates the bile. So bile leaves our liver via the canaliculi, and it collects in the right and left hepatic ducts. Those feed into our gallbladder. So I don't think you can really see it in this picture. Okay, that's right. So the sphincter of Oddi is also our hepatopancreatic sphincter. And so that's the sphincter of Oddi. It controls the flow of bile and pancreatic juice into the duodenum. So the gallbladder is going to store and concentrate the bile. It's going to go down to meet where the pancreas is at as well. And that sphincter of Oddi, or the hepatopancreatic sphincter, is what controls the flow of our bile and pancreatic juice into the duodenum. Remember, that's the first part of our small intestine. Okay, the pancreas. Another accessory organ of the digestive system. We talked about this with the endocrine system as well. It is an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So it's broken into what's known as the body of the pancreas and the tail of the pancreas. So the endocrine side of things, the endocrine function centers on the pancreatic isolates. So that's where the endocrine function is, and that's what secretes our insulin and glucagon. So that's our sugar storage and release control. We have acinar cells. Those secrete digestive enzymes, which are inactive. They don't become activated until they're in the duodenum, but these enzymes are very important to help break down lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates, our three major nutrients. There's also duct cells. So those secrete sodium bicarbonate. So if you remember from some of our discussions about pH, sodium bicarbonate is a basic liquid. So it has quite a high pH compared to the hydrochloric acid and highly acidic chyme coming from the stomach. So it kind of neutralizes the chyme so that it's not crazy acidic as it goes into our duodenum. So the duct cells secrete the sodium bicarbonate that helps buffer the highly acidic chyme. Our acinar cells, those are what are secreting the digestive enzymes, and then the pancreatic isolates, those are what are secreting insulin and glucagon. So a very important, very tiny, but very important organ. Okay, and finally we get back to the alimentary canal with the small intestine. So we just talked about all of the important accessory structures that kind of play their role as the food is going to go from the stomach to the small intestine. So the small intestine is three parts: DJI, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. So our duodenum is where a majority of the actual digestive processes are going to take place, or the breakdown is going to take place. The jejunum, or the middle portion, is where a lot of the nutrient absorption is going to take place. And then the ileum is where our Peyer's patches are. So the duodenum, like you said, the stomach acid's neutralized with the sodium bicarbonate coming from the duct cells. Our pancreatic enzymes from the acinar cells are going to begin our chemical digestion. And so a lot of the initial digestive processes are going to begin there. So the jejunum is where a lot of the actual absorption takes up. So just to give you a kind of general idea, you see the different colors here. The duodenum is only about 10 inches. So it's not a very large portion, but it's kind of where we introduce, like we said, all the digestive enzymes and the beginning of the digestive process. The jejunum, because it's our absorption center, is much, much longer. If you unfolded it, it would actually be around 8 feet, which is quite large. And then we have our ileum. It's much thinner and has a lot less blood supply, but it has, like I said, it has our Peyer's patches, and that is our clusters of lymphatic nodules. So that is very important for the actual kind of immune system function and cleaning function of our small intestine. Okay, so there's contractions that occur within the intestines, and there's two reasons for this. We have a process known as segmentation. So the contraction almost pinches off a portion of the food. And so that allows it to mix with our digestive juices and kind of breaks it into smaller segments for our small intestine to deal with. And then we have peristalsis, which is more of a wave-like ripple, and that's the movement aspect. So our ring-like contractions or stronger contractions are to break the food up and help it mix. And then our wave-like contractions help it continue to move smoothly along the GI tract. Okay, so question 5, what is the purpose of the gallbladder? Does it secrete pancreatic enzymes, produce digestive enzymes, produce bile, or store bile? D, it stores the bile. It also concentrates it. So the gallbladder has no role in producing or secreting digestive enzymes. That's the pancreas. And bile is secreted by our hepatic cells. So the gallbladder is just storing and concentrating bile. It is not producing it itself. Okay, we talked about the layers of the intestine, but we're going to talk about the lining itself a little bit more. So you can see our lining has a lot of these circular folds, and that slows the progress of chyme. It's kind of like speed bumps in a way. So it slows our chyme so that we can actually break it down and absorb what we need to from it. But they also increase surface area. So the more surface area, the more that our villi can do their job. So this is a super zoomed in portion. These villi are little projections. So there's pores at the base of these villi known as intestinal crypts, and they contain goblet cells. So these goblet cells secrete mucus, which help with the passage of food. They also have ridiculously rapid growth. So our villi kind of cells die off relatively quickly or are shed relatively quickly. So at the base, these intestinal crypts are constantly producing new cells that can replace these shedding cells. So there's also a unit known as a lacteal that is in the core of each villi, and that it consists of an arteriole, a venule, and a lymph vessel. So on the surface of the villi are very absorptive epithelial cells, and as we said, there's the goblet cells that are secreting mucus. So the lacteal is really the blood supply and return for our villi. The epithelial cells, now we're zooming in even further, that cover our villi have what's known as a brush border of even finer microvilli. And so again, this helps us increase surface area for digestion. And they also produce digestive enzymes themselves. So we're trying to get as much contact with our chyme and the nutrients as possible. Okay, moving on to the next part, we have the large intestine. So this has a few different parts as well. Sorry, you guys heard that barking there. So the large intestine begins in a blind pouch known as the cecum. So the cecum is the start down here. So here's the ileum. That's the last portion of our small intestine. There's the ileocecal valve, which is going to allow the food or waste to go from the ileum into the cecum. So one other portion to point out here is you see this little kind of tail popping off of the cecum. That is your appendix. So you would have never thought, I'm sure there's at least a few of you that have had your appendix taken out at this point in your lives, or have heard of appendicitis. So what the appendix does, they a lot of times people say that it does nothing because they can take it out and you're fine, but that's not true. It does have a role. The appendix has masses of lymphoid tissue, so it's one of our sources of immune cells, but that is where your appendix is. So then we go from the cecum up the ascending colon. Right around here is where we would actually hit our liver. That's why it turns. And so then we're going to go across the transverse colon, which is below the liver and the stomach and the spleen. It's then going to get out of the way of our spleen and turn again to go down the descending colon. And then we have this last portion as it turns is the sigmoid colon. The rectum itself is this last 7 to 8 inches of the intestine. And then we have our anal canal, which makes up the last inch of the rectum and opens obviously to the exterior through our anus. So there's 2 different sphincters within the anus. We have our internal sphincter that is involuntary smooth muscle. So we do not have control over our internal sphincter. And then we have the external sphincter, which is composed of skeletal muscle. So external is voluntary skeletal muscle. Internal is involuntary smooth muscle. This animation is a good one. It takes you kind of through the whole process, more or less, of digestion. So I think that's a good way to kind of bring all of it together. Like I said, there's a lot that goes on in our digestive system because it travels all the way from our mouth to our anus. So I know I've thrown a lot of information at you guys in this lecture. Okay, so we talked about chemical digestion and absorption a few times throughout the chapter already. So obviously, kind of it starts up in the mouth with the saliva, and it continues throughout the stomach and the small intestine using digestive enzymes. So it transforms our food molecules into particles that can actually be absorbed. Like I said, it starts with saliva, but a majority of this will occur in the small intestine. And based on the different nutrients, whether it's fat versus carbs versus protein, that process looks a little bit different. So we're going to go through kind of the major categories and how they are broken down. So for carbohydrates, it begins in the mouth with amylase. Like we said earlier, that breaks down starch. It's going to continue in the small intestine with pancreatic amylase rather than amylase within our saliva. And it will finish with those villi and microvilli with sucrase, lactase, and maltase. So that's breaking down just different types of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is a relatively broad category. So for protein, this does not begin until we get to the stomach. So there is nothing in our saliva that can help us begin the digestion of protein. So it begins in the stomach with pepsin. It's going to continue in the duodenum with trypsin and chymotrypsin. And then in the small intestine, substances known as peptidases are introduced that also help us break down and absorb our protein. Fat digestion first requires emulsification. So we do have lipase in our saliva that helps begin to break fat down, but we can't really digest it until it is emulsified, which really means kind of combined with liquid. So we're going to also have pancreatic lipase that helps to break it down in the small intestine. Some of the fat is going to be absorbed into the bloodstream of the villi, and then other fats can be converted into triglycerides, and those will actually enter the lymphatic system. Okay, so most nutrients are absorbed in the A, stomach, B, small intestine, C, large intestine, or D, mouth. So B, small intestine. So the stomach obviously has a role in some breakdown of the nutrients. Same thing with the mouth. Our saliva helps begin with breakdown of food and nutrients, but the actual absorption occurs in the small intestine. The large intestine is more of a transport of our waste, so it does not have any real role in digestion or absorption. And that is our last slide here. So like I said, I know that was a long one, and that will make up a bulk of our final exam. Have a good day, guys.